Clicker will work. Maybe it'll work for me this time. So tonight we're going to study it's another, I guess you'd consider it an ancient text. It's this one right here. It's called, Is Matthew the Touchstone That Confirms the Metaphorical Resurrection Hypothesis, from the acclaimed author and historian and researcher, Dr. Philip Anthony Gray. This is his dissertation.
Well, it's an ancient author, it's an ancient book.
Yeah. I was being a little facetious, a little humorous there, but I asked Philip about this the other day, and he probably doesn't remember. He was probably distracted, and said that it was fine for me to develop a lesson based on it. I had scanned this in, wanted to convert it to a PDF, and actually converted it to a English as a second language translation for his students. Thought that that would be a fun exercise. I did that with the Paley books, and so I thought, well, give this a shot and see how it goes. So this is going to be a 7-session Bible study. This is again based on the scholarship of Dr. Gray. This is Amherst, am I saying that right? Amherst University School of Theology, 2016. So, 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago. So we're, playing that, the 10th anniversary, so to speak. So this is going to be the series at a glance. Session 1 tonight will be the question that won't go away. Then we'll have session 2 next week, dead certain. Well, actually, let's talk about that after a bit. What ancient people believed about the afterlife. Session 3 will be reading between the lines, Matthew's implicit teachings. Then we'll have the language of resurrection, the Sadducees' debate. And is that Egairo?
That's the way I've always put it.
Egairo, okay. And we'll talk about that word tonight. Then we'll get to specifically the touchstone. Hey, Barbara. That is the rising saints of Matthew 27. He is not here, the empty tomb and the appearances. And then session 7, history or metaphor, the final verdict. So that's kind of the game plan. Let's talk a little bit more about the author, Dr. Gray. Dr. Philip Gray submitted his doctoral dissertation at Amherst University's Turner School of Theology in 2016. His research addresses a specific and consequential question in New Testament scholarship. Did Matthew indeed intend for his resurrection narrative to be read in a literal historical to be read as literal historical description, or as an extended metaphor or metaphor, if you want to pronounce it the wrong way? Just kidding. I grew up saying metaphor, and I had people correct me and say metaphor. So I'll just take the L. And theological fiction. So did he mean it or not? His method is inductive. He reads Matthew from beginning to end, cataloging every passage that touches on resurrection, the afterlife, the soul, judgment, and the nature of the body. His conclusion, should we say it now or shall I wait for the 7th? I'm just kidding. Matthew intended to report a literal physical resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So that's kind of the spoiler. So, opening up the conversation, the question that won't go away. Then let's think about it. I know we might want to gloss over this. We might just instinctively just not really think about it a lot, because it's not as simple as it might first sound. When Matthew wrote his account of Jesus rising from the dead, did he mean it literally? So, of course, I'm sure all of us are probably thinking, well, of course he did. We believe Jesus rose from the dead. The tomb was empty. The women saw him. The disciples saw him. That's the whole point of the gospel. Literally. And you're absolutely right to think that. But here's what you may not know. There are serious scholars. Well, I guess you call them serious. Would that be? They're scholars. They can't be serious. No. But people who are very intent and very learned, people with PhDs, people who have spent their lives studying the New Testament, who argue that Matthew never intended the resurrection story to be read as a literal historical claim at all. So I hear you now saying, are you saying some scholars don't believe in the resurrection? Some don't, yes. But that's not actually the most interesting version of the argument. The more interesting version, the one that prompted Dr. Gray to write his doctoral dissertation, is this. Some scholars argue that Matthew himself, the author of the gospel, was deliberately writing in a non-literal mode. They say he was crafting a kind of extended parable or theological story, not making a historical claim. They argue that the resurrection narrative was never meant to be taken at face value any more than the parable of the prodigal son was meant to describe an actual father and an actual son. So, you might say that seems kind of like a stretch, that Matthew tells the story pretty plainly. And that's exactly what Dr. Gray argues. And he spent years building the case. But to understand why the argument even needs to be made, we need to know something about the debate that prompted it. And to do that, we need to meet the scholars on the other side. Not because we're going to agree with them, but because you can't answer a challenge you've never actually heard. Now, there's an introductory section here. Who is Dr. Philip Gray? So you correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. It's worth spending a moment before we get into the debate itself on the man whose work we're studying, because this series is partly a tribute to him. Dr. Gray earned his PhD from Ambridge University's Turner School of Theology in 2016. His dissertation is a careful, rigorous, and deeply faithful piece of scholarship. Dr. Gray is not a detached academic writing for other academics. He is a Christian who takes the resurrection seriously as an event that actually happened, and who wanted to demonstrate, using the best tools of biblical scholarship, that the Gospel of Matthew presents it that way too. What makes Dr. Gray's work remarkable is his method. Rather than simply arguing from the end of Matthew, the resurrection chapters, he worked through the entire gospel from chapter 1 to chapter 28, cataloging every passage that touches on life after death, resurrection, the soul, heaven, hell, and the nature of the body. His principle was simple. Matthew is his own best interpreter. If you want to know what Matthew meant when he described the resurrection of Jesus in chapter 28, you need to know how he uses resurrection language throughout the other 27 chapters. Is that a fair assessment?
Actually, it's been 10 years, so I don't remember what it is.
Well, you know what you know. So, what did he find? I hear you thinking. He found that Matthew's language about resurrection is entirely consistent and entirely physical from first to last. There's not a single passage in Matthew where the language of raising the dead is used figuratively. Every time Matthew uses the Greek word for raise, egeiro, he means a body returning to physical life. And the resurrection of Jesus, he argues, is no different. Dr. Gray's conclusion is a confident one. Matthew intended to report a literal, physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. All right. Sorry, I should have shown that one a moment ago. You can read that while we get to the next slide. So here's the challenge, the metaphorical resurrection hypothesis. To understand why Dr. Gray's argument matters, we need to understand the position he was responding to. It goes by the name, the metaphorical resurrection hypothesis, and it has been gaining ground in academic theology for the past several decades. So let's try to explain this as clearly as possible because it's easy to misunderstand. The metaphorical resurrection hypothesis is not simply the claim that the resurrection didn't happen. That's a different argument. The metaphorical hypothesis is the claim that the gospel writers, including Matthew, never intended their resurrection stories to be read as historical claims in the first place. They were writing something more like extended parables. The resurrection story is, on this view, theological fiction, and not because Matthew was deceiving anyone, but because everyone in his audience would have understood that this kind of religious storytelling was not meant to describe a literal event. Is that fair to say? It's kind of reminiscent of the argument that people would have for, the first few chapters of Genesis, right? The creation story. Say, well, not 7 literal days, just some metaphorical. So that's quite a lot to take in if you've never heard that or you didn't know that people believe that sort of thing. And it's worth separating this view from some other views that get confused with it. So let's put 3 different positions on the table. So here's position 1, the visionary hypothesis. The disciples did experience something real after Jesus' death, genuine, sincere visions of Jesus, but those visions were psychological or spiritual in nature, not physical encounters with a risen body. Over time, as the story was told and retold in early Christian communities, it gradually took on more physical, concrete detail. And by the time Matthew wrote, the tradition described what looks like a bodily resurrection, even though the original experience was visionary. Position number 2, the metaphorical hypothesis. The gospel writers, including Matthew, were sophisticated authors who knew exactly what they were doing. They were not passing on embellished tradition without realizing how it sounded. They were deliberately writing theological metaphors. The resurrection story was never intended to describe a literal event. It's a parable about the ongoing power of Jesus' teaching and presence, a story that conveys deep religious truth without making a historical claim. And then there's the third position, which is the literal view. The literal view. The gospel writers intended to describe real historical events. Matthew meant what he said. An empty tomb, a risen body, genuine physical encounters with the risen Jesus. This is the traditional reading and the one that Dr. Gray's research confirms. So, his dissertation is written primarily to challenge position number 2, the metaphorical hypothesis. His response to position 1 is also important, but it's secondary. And on position 3, he is firmly in agreement with the traditional view.
Chris, I don't remember if it comes out later,
Uh-huh.
but under the first alternative evolutionary hypothesis,
Mm-hmm.
there are two varieties. One is naturalistic and the other is supernaturalistic. Some would say Jesus never literally rose from the grave, but there were visions that were inspired in the minds of the earliest witnesses. They saw him out in the Hadean realm through the eye of faith, but that God himself did it. The other view says it was merely psychological, to be explained in purely naturalistic terms. They were just in such grief they thought it up that way.
Okay. So the I guess the more finely tuned understanding of position 1 is that there are some people that say that it was just a hallucination, basically, that it didn't actually happen. People just imagined it. But then there are others who would say, well, we won't go that far. It was a vision given to them by God, inspiration, the Holy Spirit, and they actually saw it. So that's kind of you're trying to split the baby, I guess, with that one, right? You're trying to say that the resurrection didn't happen, but there was still inspiration.
But you have theological liberals who try to hold on to some semblance of belief in God. So they would say, in some sense, Jesus still lives. His spirit lives in another realm, and they were privy to that. They were given that inspired vision of him. Then you have the atheists. I think it's like Ludeman, who I think I mentioned here,
Mm-hmm.
Who will outright reject any kind of. The whole thing is naturalistic. It's all explained away by purely chemical causes in the brain. So that's usually one is the atheistic approach, the other is the liberal theological approach.
And they're both wrong.
Yeah.
So that's what they have in common. So I hear you ask, why does it matter whether Matthew intended it as metaphor or not? Isn't the real question whether the resurrection actually happened? Well, that's a great question. And it shows you that you're already thinking carefully. Here's the distinction. Dr. Gray's study is primarily about authorial intent, what Matthew meant to communicate, not about whether the resurrection actually happened. His argument is more limited and in some ways more powerful for it. He's not trying to prove the resurrection. He is trying to show that Matthew, the author of the gospel, was writing about a real physical event, not a parable. Whether that event actually occurred is a separate question, but if Dr. Gray is right, then anyone who reads Matthew as metaphor has misread the text. They've gotten the basic genre of the document wrong. All right, so let's talk about the touchstone, which I believe the title of the dissertation refers to. Matthew 27, 51b through 53. So what specifically prompted Dr. Gray's research? It began with a single passage, one of the strangest and most debated passages in the entire New Testament. So if you want to open your Bible, you can, or we'll just read it for you here. Matthew 27, beginning at verse 51. We're going to read the account of Jesus' death on the cross, and we want you to notice what happens immediately after he dies. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. So, of course, we've read that before, but let's just let it sink in for a moment. At the moment of Jesus' death, dead saints rise from their tombs, wait until after the resurrection, and then walk into Jerusalem and appear to many people. It is by any measure a remarkable passage. No other gospel records anything like it. No non-Christian historical source from the period mentions it. So, Anybody want to chime in? Is that a verse that you've thought about? I know we've talked about it before in passing. Has anybody got any commentary on it before we move on? You find it strange, disconcerting, comforting? A little spooky, yeah. Well, honestly, I think a lot of times we might read that passage and just kind of move on without a whole lot of commentary, right? Because it's a lot to get into when you start talking about, other people rising from the dead. Go ahead.
One of the things I plan to explore before I finish this particular dissertation, earlier on I was studying to deal only with those three verses, about two and a half, three verses there.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the idea is in scholarship, when you write a dissertation, you're supposed to try to break new ground if you can. It's almost impossible to do that these days. So many thousands have gone through the programs. Somewhere somebody's touched on some aspect of your subject, no matter what you choose. You just can't find a virgin subject, you might say. But I was going to deal with this in my coach, you might say, in the graduate school, said, I don't think anybody that I know of has ever dealt with it. So you probably are breaking fresh, coming up with fresh study. And I worked on that for a while, maybe 2 or 3 years, until I came across a Harvard dissertation that had been turned in back in the late 60s or early 70s.
Yeah.
And it was outstandingly good. I mean, it was the best, one of the most detailed things I've ever seen. Now, this guy, he was not necessarily conservative, but he dealt with every aspect. He dealt with German theological sources and all kinds of stuff. There was just no way I could hold a candle to that. So I came back and had to regroup, and I told my coach, my advisor, I said, look, I'm going to have to do something different. He disagreed. He wanted me to stay with it. But I said, no, if you'd read his dissertation, you'd realize I can't compare to that. So I'll try to find something maybe with more apologetical use down the road.
Yeah.
And when I came across Miller's, you're probably bring that up, Miller's writings, where he said it's obvious this story's fake.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, William Lane Craig says that too. It's just fake. It never really happened. It's all a metaphor. But Miller went on to say, so that tells us what he meant to do with the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't mean anybody take this literally. Nobody's going to really believe that happened. That was the argument. So I thought that's what I've got to deal with from that standpoint, because the other dissertation didn't look at that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I ended up with the particular one I came up with.
Well, that's good. That's interesting. I think that people, scholars would tend to go that way. It's not really, didn't really mean that literally, because they're embarrassed. They're ashamed of the gospel in that regard. I mean, how else do you put it? I'm ashamed of what Matthew wrote, because he's talking about bodies rising. So then you have to go back and, well, maybe I won't throw Matthew under the bus. Maybe I won't throw shade at him. Maybe I'll try and maybe he was doing it on purpose. Using flowery language, or So it's just it's ugly, the kinds of things that people do, and then it just takes root, and then our enemies are glad to glom onto it. And
what's maddening is that the majority problem, so many who go on to advanced studies have an agenda, or they end up way out in left field anyway. The vast majority probably are left-wingers, but not all. There are a lot of conservative scholars out there and a lot of moderates in between, but so many of them spend their lives getting their PhDs or their Doctor of Theology degrees just to tear down the Bible, and to have some gravitas when they do it, so people would listen and with their mouth open and say, oh, I never thought about that. That goes on all the time. So that's why I wish we had more conservative brothers who would go to get their advanced degrees, but who would stay conservative. You have people like Rubel Shelley, who started out with that as his intent. He had a Master of Theology degree when he was my teacher at Free. Then he went off to Vanderbilt to get a PhD in philosophy. This was a great opportunity. See, he was going to be able to debate atheists just like his mentor, Dr. Thomas B. Warren, had done.
Mm-hmm.
But when Shelley got over there to Nashville, we don't know what happened to him. He went bonkers, absolutely bonkers. and became a grade A embarrassment to the brother. And to this day, we have to disavow Shelley. And the man's good name and all that he accomplished when I was a teenager, he was a great influence. It's just all sullied, just completely ruined. But he's not the only. There are probably up into I know dozens, if not hundreds, of cases, even in the Brotherhood, where men have gone out to get their PhDs, and that's what happened.
Mm. Yeah, it's.
Well, yes, you mentioned murders. My late cousin Drew, who just recently passed, Drew McGookin.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't go off into theological liberalism. I think he just left the church, but he went and got a PhD from the University of Nebraska in speech communication. He didn't use his talents. There were multiple talents to be a gospel preacher. He had 4.0 average when he graduated from Free, which is amazing. 4 years solid record.
Wow.
He went off and never used it for anything worthwhile.
Mm.
It's heartbreaking because everybody who knew Drew realized he was a mild-mannered person. He just didn't expect that of him.
Yeah.
A good kid. His daddy, my uncle, was a great guy.
Yeah, that's sad when you have so many good people that don't use their talents, or don't use them in the right way. Yeah. Well, you are correct. I'm about to mention Robert Miller. So if you find this particular passage a bit strange or disconcerting, you're not alone. In fact, this passage was the starting point for the specific challenge that Dr. Gray set out to answer. A scholar named Robert J. Miller argued that this passage, the rising of the saints, is what he called a touchstone. His argument went like this. Matthew 27, 51b through 53 is obviously not meant to be read as literal history. Dead people walking out of tombs and appearing in Jerusalem. It reads like symbolic, apocalyptic imagery, the kind of dramatic language that Jewish writers sometimes use to signal that something of cosmic significance had just occurred. Matthew was saying in vivid, poetic terms, the death of Jesus split creation open. So, there are people that might think that that's a reasonable reading of it. You could fall into that trap of, well, maybe I guess I could see that. Miller obviously thought it was a reasonable reading of it. But here's his critical move. This passage appears immediately before the resurrection narrative in chapter 28. If Matthew was writing symbolically in verses 51 through 53, why would he suddenly shift to straightforward historical reporting just a few verses later? Miller argues that he wouldn't, and so the Rising Saints passage becomes a touchstone, a key that unlocks the meaning of everything that follows. If the saints rose metaphorically, then so did Jesus. So, his whole argument then rests on the interpretation of this one passage. It rests on the relationship between this passage and what follows it. And Dr. Gray's response is brilliant precisely because he doesn't just fight over this one passage. He says, let's look at how Matthew uses resurrection language throughout his entire gospel. If egeiro, the Greek word for raise, always means a physical body returning to life in every other context Matthew uses it, then there's no reason to treat it as metaphor in chapter 27 or chapter 28. Matthew's own vocabulary becomes the answer to Miller's challenge. So let's talk about 6 scholars across the spectrum. One of the most valuable features of Dr. Gray's study is that he surveys a range of scholarly opinion before presenting his own argument. He introduces us to 6 scholars who represent different positions, from the most skeptical to the most traditional. Getting to know these scholars will help us understand the full scope of the debate. Think of it like this. If you want to make a good argument, you need to know who disagrees with you and why. Dr. Gray doesn't just dismiss the scholars who hold different views. He engages them seriously and shows exactly where and why their arguments fall short. That's good scholarship, and it makes for a much more honest and interesting Bible study. So let's look at these 6 scholars at a glance. Gerd Ludemann, the most skeptical. Now an atheist, Ludemann argues the disciples had purely psychological visions after Jesus' death. The gospel accounts are historically unreliable. The resurrection never happened in any physical sense. Then you have John Dominic Crossan.
Yeah, y'all seen him. He's been interviewed. He's a little feisty Irish Catholic.
I would know if I saw him.
One time he was interviewed. Every time NBC or ABC wanted to get a theologist perspective on something, they'd interview him. And he was a nut, way out, but very, very influential.
He is the mega parable view. He represents the mega parable. A prominent Jesus seminar scholar, Crossan argues the Gospels are book-length mega parables, that is, deliberate theological fiction. The resurrection is a powerful story that conveys truth without making a historical claim. Famous for saying, is that Emmaus? E-M-M? Emmaus. Emmaus never happened. Emmaus always happens. So you want to clarify that for us?
In Luke's account of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, they met Jesus, and unbeknownst to them, it was the risen Jesus at first. So he asked them what their problem was. They were distraught. Don't you know what's going on? They said, we've just lost our great Savior who was just crucified. And then they were sitting and having a meal together, and suddenly their eyes were open, they recognized him, and he just kind of disappeared. So I believe that was a literal event as well. But that's why he said that's a parable, obviously. He said it may have never happened, but it always happens, because the meaning is we always open our eyes and see Jesus. That kind of stuff.
Sort of sounds like hippie stuff to me. Then you have Robert J. Miller, the touchstone argument. Miller's work directly prompted Dr. Gray's research. Miller argues Matthew 27, 51b through 53 proves the resurrection narrative was never meant literally. These 2 passages stand or fall together. Then there's Marcus Borg, What the Camera Cannot Capture. This is another Jesus seminar scholar. Borg argues that whether the resurrection could have been captured on video is beside the point. What matters is the ongoing spiritual reality of the risen Jesus in personal experience. The factual question is irrelevant to religious meaning. So they try to tell you to just don't worry about whether it's true or not. Forget about that. The important thing is the spiritual aspect of it, which that's completely wrong. You have to worry about the physical part, or the spiritual part doesn't matter. If you take away the physical truth of the resurrection, then you're destroying the spiritual part of the resurrection.
Paul said if it didn't really happen, we are all men most miserable or pitiable. We're still in our sins if it didn't happen. But people like Cross will say, well, Paul got it wrong. He was very narrow-minded about things.
Sure.
Paul could have seen, he'd have had a wide point of view like I do. I can see it didn't really have to happen for us to get good out of it.
Sure. And Ludemann probably would say, he ate something that didn't agree with him at dinner, and he, had a bad dream. And
Ludemann earlier in life described himself as a Gnostic. But by the time I came across some of his more recent works, he had some major debates with, I think, William Lane Craig. He was part of a debate on the resurrection. He just admitted he was an atheist. I've lost my faith altogether.
That's sad.
Still a New Testament scholar, and that's where he kept teaching.
Yeah, sure. That's, that's sad. Then you have Dale C. Allison Jr. He would represent the honest uncertainty. A more moderate scholar who occupies a genuinely uncertain middle ground, Allison believes the gospel writers did intend to describe a physical resurrection, but remains agnostic about whether it actually happened. He describes himself as reluctantly a cryptic deist. Cryptic deist.
That's a shame because he's one tough lineman. He's smart. He's got some real good books out there, a lot of helpful stuff. And a lot of things where, like if he would just take his own medicine, he wouldn't have to adopt these loony ideas at the end. Because the way he traces out the history, it's like you're screaming all along, you're reading it. Look, Dale, it's leading right to the truth, and then he just runs away from it.
It's sad, people can see the truth, but then they're too afraid to embrace it, I guess.
They said, the disciples could have been like in my case. I had a friend pass away, and I was not privy to that. I was not told it happened, I think, earlier that morning. I was in my study, and my friend appeared to me and spoke to me for a few minutes, and I wondered, well, how did he get in the house? And then he left, and I got to thinking, that was odd. And then I got a phone call saying, did you know so-and-so died this morning? He said, these things happen. Maybe that's what happened to them. They were just so distraught. He said, I don't know if it really has. I don't know how that happened, if it was telepathic or whatever. I thought, I know how it happened because your chronology is wrong. You thought that, you put that back into the past as retroactive after you learned about the death of your friend. I thought, that's what I thought. See, I'll explain the way naturalistically today, ghost stories.
Sure, why not? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. So, again, you're trying to explain away a supernatural event with a supernatural event that only you are a witness to.
In other words, I believe in ghosts, but I don't believe people rise from the dead.
Yeah. Oh, I don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but, I believe in, UFOs and Bigfoot and all that stuff.
See, some of the early disciples entertained that. Jesus said, look, he's eating the fish. He said, a spirit has not flesh and blood, as you see me have, flesh and bones. So, obviously, that's the whole point of the gospel was to say, look, he's not a ghost.
Yeah, come and touch the nail prints.
Yeah.
It was to dispel, their doubts, their unbelief, and it should dispel ours and people like Dale Allison. And then you have N.T. Wright, which is the traditional view. Wright's massive 817-page study is the most thorough modern defense of the traditional position. Gray's conclusions align most closely with Wright's. Matthew intended to narrate a literal corporeal resurrection using language his first-century Jewish audience would have understood in precisely those terms. So, notice that this is not a simple liberal versus conservative debate. Some of these scholars are personally religious. Crossan and Borg, for instance, retain something they call Christian faith, but on the central historical question of what Matthew intended to describe and what actually happened at the tomb, their answers are very different from the traditional view. All right, so again, the Dr. Gray's thesis agrees with Wright's most closely, that it was a literal corporeal resurrection using language first century Jewish audience would have understood in precisely those terms, and we'll see why that Jewish background matters so much when we get to session 2. So, why Matthew in particular? Why does Dr. Gray focus specifically on Matthew's gospel? After all, 4 gospels include resurrection accounts. Why not study Mark or Luke or John? Well, I think you probably would already know the answer to that based on some of the hints that we gave. It's because of the rising saints of Matthew 27, 51b through 53. That passage is unique to Matthew. No other gospel includes it. And according to Miller's argument, it is the touchstone that reveals Matthew's literary strategy. So if you want to answer Miller's challenge, you have to go to Matthew. There's also another reason. Matthew's gospel is particularly rich in its treatment of resurrection and the afterlife. He records Jesus' debate with the Sadducees about resurrection, the most direct discussion of the subject in any of the Gospels. He records multiple explicit predictions of the resurrection, He records Jesus teaching about the soul, about hell, about eternal life, about the final judgment. All of this material spread across 28 chapters gives Dr. Gray an enormous body of evidence to work with. Matthew, he argues, is his own best interpreter, and the evidence across all 28 chapters points in one direction: literal, physical, bodily resurrection. We'll go ahead and flip to this next one. I don't know if I was supposed to have shown this one already. Let me see. Yeah. I think we've already covered that one pretty much. So, before we close this session, let's preview the road ahead so you know what to expect over the coming weeks. Dr. Gray's dissertation has 4 chapters, and our study roughly follows the same structure. We'll spend 2 sessions on the background, what people in Matthew's world believed about life after death, why that context matters for reading the text. Then we'll spend 3 sessions working through Matthew's gospel itself, looking at all the relevant passages. And then finally, we'll spend a session on the big picture question: is Matthew writing history or parable? And then we'll close with a session on what all this means for us personally as Christians. So we're going to close this session, and then we can have discussions. We can have discussion questions. I've got some if you're interested in that. But we're going to close the session with a reflection from Dr. Gray's own work. After surveying all the scholars who argue for a metaphorical reading of Matthew, he makes this observation: were it not for the miraculous elements in some of the events related therein, theories positing interpretations of Matthew as metaphor, midrash, myth, or megaparable would have never arisen. In other words, the reason some scholars read the resurrection as metaphor is not that the literary evidence demands it. It's that they have already decided on philosophical grounds that miracles don't happen. That's not a conclusion they reached by reading Matthew carefully. It's an assumption they brought to the text before they started reading. Dr. Gray's study is an invitation to do something different, to let Matthew speak for himself. Is there anything you want to add as we wrap up? Anything else that you think we might need some clarification on, or anything you want to add?
No, I'll just say, after reading what you submitted me a few weeks ago, the 2 different versions of and hearing this tonight, and being reminded of things I'd written 10 or 15 years ago, so I started it. I'm terrified of AI. It's frightening. The stuff you're doing, it's like, really? How did it know all of that? I've forgotten all of it, but I guess it read my dissertation.
Yeah, it read your dissertation. That's the point. That's exactly the point.
Somebody did.
It's, well, hopefully, and that's what I hope that we can do, is to, get some traction. I mean, we read everybody else's work. We study everybody else's work. Why not study somebody we can appreciate,
You can ask what some authors intent. There he is.
Exactly. And, if there's a question, we can ask you about it.
Well, AI will tell you what mine.
Well, I can't read your mind, just your book. So, again, just before we close out, we want to highlight and just reiterate that this touchstone argument that Miller makes is central to this entire series. The argument isn't complicated. If Matthew 27, 51 to 53 was meant metaphorically, then chapter 28 was meant the same way, because the 2 passages are too close together and too stylistically similar for Matthew to have shifted between them. So Dr. Gray's counter argument is that nothing in Matthew's text signals that shift into metaphorical writing, and that the word egeiro means the same thing in both passages. Specific evidence to the contrary.
Chris, honestly, in most churches of Christ, I doubt this issue has plagued anybody, maybe very few. Not in this way, anyway. So that's one of the reasons I never myself thought it worthy of bringing into a whole discussion. But I guess in denominational churches around us, especially the mainliner churches like Methodist and Presbyterian churches, this would be an issue because their so-called pastor or preacher would very likely hold to a position like this. Not all of them, but many of them do. So it's not the sort of thing we are usually worried about.
Yeah. Well, and I thought about that too. I thought, maybe this is, I was afraid maybe it might be a niche issue perhaps or something, that would, but I don't think so. I think that the arguments are sound, the discussion elements that are to be had during, talking about these things, they're applicable to a whole host of other issues, right? I mean, you can apply the same sort of critical thinking to a bunch of other things. I mean, because everything literally about the Bible is under attack in one form or another. So to me, I think it's timely. I think, unfortunately, the arguments can be used other places. And you can never go wrong taking this kind of study, the kind of thought, the kind of time and effort that you put into it. There is a lot of stuff that we can extract from this. I think this is a good venue for it. And plus, again, as we say, you got the author right here who can, elaborate, throw out new ideas, different ideas, additional, research. So I think it's interesting personally. And it's not something, again, you don't run into it all the time, but you can kind of see it. And if you can hear these other arguments, it's just fantasy, it's just poetic language, it isn't really real.
Back in the earlier 2000s, prior to the time I started working on this, the Jesus seminar was very popular in the average media. I mean, they were interviewed, these representatives like Borg and Crossan and others, a lot. And they'd always want to get their take on any theological argument, like, what do you think about abortion, whatever. These people, the Jesus seminar tried to label themselves as brand new scholars with cutting edge ideas. They really weren't. They had just taken old ideas from German liberalism from like the 18th century, especially early 19th century, and they just put it in more popular language. I mean, more up-to-date language. It's the same stuff, going back to Buchanan and others he was early 20th century. And but you don't hear that much about the Jesus Seminar anymore. But when I first started this, there were times when people would have heard some of these views just watching television, or reading the paper. But I haven't heard from the Jesus Seminar in a while. I don't know if they're still around anymore.
Well, I don't know. I've heard that term before. But what's interesting to me is, if you listen to what Miller is saying, you can see, well, maybe I guess I could kind of understand where he's going with that. I don't agree with it, but I could see where you might try to make an argument out of it. It'd be a pretty thin argument. But if you're making this argument, somebody might make it about something else. It's always good to have an answer ready. And it's always good to think about things that, even if you think they are a little out of the standard thoroughfare, off the beaten path. Still, I think it's good to help train our brains to be prepared for any kind of out of the blue, off the wall kind of a.
Well, to me, isn't it one of the two, or maybe we could even say three essential fundamental questions that only are the ones that only matter? Does God exist? That's number one essential out of all the questions we could ask. And then number two, did Jesus really was he really resurrected? And or is the Bible inspired? They're all kind of together, those two or those three.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's how could it be any more relevant? I mean, yeah, I think it's very.
I agree. And
It's so basic.
yeah, it's I mean, it is fundamental. It is, speaking of stones, it's a cornerstone of our faith. And so the argument against it is one way, it is one thing. But the arguments that we're going to see that support the truthfulness, the just plain language of the Bible is also another argument. It's something that we need to have in the chamber ready to go. So anyway, appreciate your attention. We'll hit the button here to do the outro.